Nestled in the quiet hills of Westport, Connecticut, Paul Newman's former estate had long been a place of admiration. The sprawling colonial-style home, with its wide verandas and lush gardens, had once been a sanctuary for the legendary actor. But after his passing in 2008, the property changed hands multiple times, each new owner never staying for long. That changed when Thomas and Claire Peterson, a successful couple from New York, decided to leave behind the chaos of the city for a slower, more peaceful life. They had always admired the estate from afar, drawn to its rich history and the undeniable charm of a house that had once belonged to Hollywood royalty. The house, though elegant, had an eerie stillness about it. The Petersons dismissed it at first, believing it was simply the weight of history pressing upon them. But as the weeks passed, Claire began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. Doors left ajar when she was certain they had been closed. The distinct scent of popcorn drifting through the air at odd hours, always late at night. And then there were the sounds. It started subtly, a shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, the creak of a chair as if someone had just settled into it. Thomas, a rational man, chalked it up to an old house settling, but Claire wasn't so sure. One evening, she found herself alone in the home theater Paul Newman had personally designed. She was organizing a few old film reels left behind when the screen flickered to life. There, playing in crisp black and white, was Somebody Up There Likes Me, one of Newman's earliest films. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas?" she called. But she already knew he wasn't home. The film played on, but the real terror came when she heard a low, amused chuckle. Not from the film, but from somewhere in the room. Claire turned sharply, her pulse hammering. The plush leather seat in the middle row was reclined, as if someone had just been sitting there. The scent of popcorn was suddenly overwhelming. The next morning, Thomas finally admitted he had felt something too. More than once, while working in the study, he'd noticed the distinct scent of whiskey and leather, a smell he later learned was Newman's signature cologne. Determined to get answers, the Petersons reached out to a local historian, who shared a surprising story. Newman, a man of deep passion for his craft, had spent countless nights in that theater, rewatching his own performances, studying them, critiquing them. It was said that even in his later years, he would retreat there, a glass of bourbon in hand, lost in the flickering glow of the screen. After that, the Petersons stopped fearing the ghost of Paul Newman. They even came to embrace his presence. Every so often, Claire would find an old movie playing in the theater, the scent of popcorn hanging in the air. She and Thomas would sit, watching in silence, feeling as though they had been granted a glimpse into something sacred. And on those nights, as the credits rolled, they swore they could hear the soft, familiar chuckle of a Hollywood legend who had never truly left. The autumn wind whispered through the ancient maples that lined the Petersons' driveway, their golden leaves fluttering like fragile remnants of time. The house, with its grand white columns and shuttered windows, stood in regal silence against the deepening twilight, as though it were holding its breath. Claire stood on the wraparound porch, her fingers resting lightly against the wooden railing, staring out at the endless stretch of forest that bordered their land. It was quiet now, but the quiet never felt truly empty. Not anymore. Inside, Thomas sat at his mahogany desk in the study, his laptop open but forgotten, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows against the bookshelves lined with old volumes and forgotten scripts. The scent of aged paper mingled with something else, something fleeting. It was subtle, just a whisper of aroma, but unmistakable. A smoky richness, tinged with the sweetness of oak. Bourbon. His breath hitched slightly, though he tried to dismiss it as his mind playing tricks on him. And yet it was not the first time. A soft creak from the leather armchair across the room made his spine stiffen. He turned his gaze slowly, his pulse quickening. The chair sat in its usual place, angled toward the fireplace, untouched. But Thomas could not ignore the feeling that someone had just been there, watching him. The air felt heavier, thick with an unseen presence, yet not menacing. If anything, it felt patient. He swallowed, forcing a laugh under his breath. "I hope you liked the whiskey I left out for you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, feeling a little ridiculous speaking to an empty room. But even as he turned back to his work, he knew the house was listening. Meanwhile, in the home theater, Claire traced her fingers along the armrests of the plush seats, her gaze fixed on the massive projection screen that stood still and lifeless in the dim light. The room carried the distinct scent of old fabric and polished wood, but beneath it lingered something else, something warm, buttery, and oddly nostalgic. The unmistakable scent of freshly popped popcorn. She let out a slow breath, lowering herself into one of the seats, feeling the soft give of the cushion beneath her. The silence stretched around her, heavy but expectant, like a held note in a symphony. She had come to recognize this feeling, the sensation of being in the presence of something just beyond the veil of sight. It no longer frightened her. Then, as if on cue, the screen flickered to life. The dim glow illuminated the empty rows, casting shifting shadows along the walls. At first, the image was nothing but static, a soft, crackling hum filling the air. Then, as the distortion cleared, an old film began to play. It was Cool Hand Luke. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The film was one of Newman's most iconic roles, the one that had cemented him as a legend. She had seen it before, but never like this, never with the feeling that she was not alone. The film rolled on, the sound low but crisp, as though someone had adjusted it to the perfect volume. Then, in the flickering glow, she saw a shift in the air. A subtle depression in the seat 3 rows ahead of her. It was the briefest of movements, a trick of the light perhaps, but it sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to speak, to acknowledge the presence she now knew was there, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply watched. And then, amidst the soft hum of the projector and the distant rustling of wind outside, she heard it. A quiet chuckle. Low, amused, unmistakably familiar. Claire exhaled, her fingers tightening around the armrest, her pulse slowing to a steady rhythm. She did not run. She did not scream. Instead, she leaned back into her seat, her gaze still fixed on the screen, and whispered, "Good choice." For a long moment, there was nothing. And then, just barely audible above the film's dialogue, came a response. A second chuckle. Soft, warm, almost grateful. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The theater remained dim, the only light coming from the flickering images on the screen. The glow cast soft, undulating shadows across the walls, stretching and retreating like ghosts of their own. Claire sat motionless, her breath slow and measured, as if any sudden movement might disturb the delicate balance of this moment. Outside, the wind murmured through the trees, their branches scratching lightly against the house, a sound so faint it might have been the whisper of a distant memory. Somewhere deep within the walls, the old bones of the estate shifted a soft creak, a settling sigh, as though the house itself acknowledged its lingering guest. Claire's eyes remained on the screen, but her mind drifted. She had read about hauntings before, cold spots, flickering lights, objects moving without explanation. But this was different. It was not frightening, nor was it oppressive. If anything, it felt like an invitation. The scent of popcorn still hung in the air, rich and unmistakable, though she had not made any. It was stronger now, almost fresh, as if a bowl sat just out of sight, waiting to be claimed. Her fingers twitched slightly, the old childhood instinct kicking in, a desire to reach for a handful, to feel the buttery warmth against her skin. A faint rustling sounded from the front row. Not loud, not deliberate, just enough to make her chest tighten with something that was not quite fear, more like reverence. She swallowed, moistening her lips before speaking. "Are you really here?" Silence. The film continued, the distant drawl of Paul Newman's voice drifting through the air. The scene was one she knew well. Luke, grinning through bloodied lips, defiant even in defeat. Then, from the shadows, something stirred. It was not movement in the traditional sense. No solid form emerged, no shadow detached itself from the wall. And yet, the very air seemed to shift, growing heavier, more present. It was as if someone had exhaled nearby, a breath just close enough to be felt but not seen. Claire clenched her hands in her lap. The chair in front of her, the one with the barely perceptible depression, creaked ever so slightly, the leather shifting. She wanted to turn away, to run her fingers over her arms and reassure herself that it was nothing more than an overactive imagination, a trick of the mind. But the truth settled deep in her bones, undeniable. The ghost of Paul Newman was here, and he was watching his own movie. The realization should have unsettled her, but instead, she found herself smiling, a small, hesitant curve of her lips. It was almost funny in a way. Even in death, Paul Newman was still doing what he had always done, studying his work, revisiting the past. A low hum filled the room, barely more than a vibration in the air. Not a voice, not a word, just a feeling, presence. The screen flickered. The film sputtered slightly, the image distorting for the briefest of moments. Then, as if the universe had snapped its fingers, the scene changed. Claire gasped. This was not Cool Hand Luke anymore. It was footage she had never seen before. A grainy, sun-warmed image filled the screen, a younger Paul, standing beside a race car, his hair tousled by the wind, a smirk playing at his lips. The camera shook slightly, as if held by an unsteady hand, capturing a candid moment rather than a scripted one. He turned toward whoever was filming, lifting a hand in greeting, his blue eyes crinkling with laughter. Claire's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't part of any movie she knew. This was something else, something personal. The softest exhale drifted through the room, a sound so gentle she might have imagined it. But she hadn't. She was seeing what he wanted her to see. Her fingers curled against the fabric of the seat. "Who are you showing this to?" she whispered. The screen flickered again, the image cutting out. Then, a single word, not spoken, not heard, but felt. "You." Claire's breath caught in her throat. The word hadn't come from the speakers. It hadn't echoed in the room in any audible way. And yet, she had heard it deep in her bones, in the space between heartbeats, in the air itself. The screen remained dark for a moment longer, its emptiness almost taunting, before another flicker of light breathed life back into it. The image had changed. No longer the race car, no longer the sunlit candidness of a man in motion. Instead, she saw something startling in its simplicity. Paul Newman sitting alone in a dimly lit room, a tumbler of whiskey resting in his hand, his gaze unfocused yet contemplative. Claire barely moved, afraid that even the softest shift of her body might break whatever spell had woven itself around her. The footage was raw, unpolished. This wasn't a scene from a movie. It was real. Paul leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly, his expression unreadable. The camera seemed to be waiting for him, lingering on the stillness of the moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I wonder sometimes," he mused, his voice low, intimate, "if any of it really matters in the end. The films, the fame, the goddamn money." He let out a quiet laugh, one that held no real humor. Claire felt her fingers dig into the armrest. This was private, something never meant for an audience. A man speaking not for a camera, not for a legacy, but for himself. Paul swirled the liquid in his glass, watching it move as if searching for answers in the amber depths. "You work your whole life trying to make something that lasts, trying to mean something." He exhaled, tapping his fingers absently against the glass. "And then one day you're gone, and all that's left is what?" His gaze lifted, meeting the camera's lens directly. Claire's breath shuddered out of her. He was looking at her. She knew it was impossible, knew this was nothing more than an old, forgotten recording. But in that moment, in the flickering half-light of the room, it felt as if he saw her. Not just in a way an actor might look into a lens, but truly saw her. A shadow stirred in the corner of her vision. The chair in front of her shifted again, its leather groaning softly. The air thickened, charged with an unseen energy. The screen flickered. The footage wavered, but not like film degrading, more like a presence weaving through it, something unseen threading itself into the space between frames. Paul tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. And then, "I was never afraid of dying," he murmured. The words settled like a weight on Claire's chest. The film crackled. The image warped, shuddering as if struggling to hold itself together. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the screen went dark. Claire sat frozen, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. The scent of whiskey and popcorn clung to the air. She swallowed, her throat tight, her mind reeling. The house was speaking to her. No, he was speaking to her. And for the first time since she and Thomas had moved in, she realized something. The ghost of Paul Newman wasn't just haunting this house. He was waiting. The house had fallen into a deep and reverent silence. Not the kind of silence that brought peace, but the kind that carried weight, the kind that came after something had been revealed and was waiting to see what you would do with it. Claire remained in her seat, her fingers still curled against the armrest, her pulse an unsteady rhythm beneath her skin. The darkness of the screen loomed before her, its emptiness charged with something unseen, something expectant. The scent of whiskey and popcorn lingered, neither fading nor strengthening, as if the house itself had exhaled but had not yet drawn its next breath. She wanted to move, to stand, to flee, to call for Thomas. But something deeper, something more instinctual held her in place. It was not fear. It was something far more elusive. Curiosity, the kind that tightened in her chest, that whispered stay and listen, that told her she was standing at the threshold of something just beyond her understanding. The weight in the air shifted, a subtle change like the room itself had leaned in. And then, a sound. Soft, deliberate, undeniably real. A single ice cube settling in a glass. Claire's stomach clenched. She turned her head slowly, afraid of what she might see. The seat in front of her, the one that had creaked under an unseen presence, was unchanged. No shadow, no shifting form. But she felt him there, as real as the velvet fabric beneath her fingertips. A heartbeat passed, then another, and then the film screen flickered back to life. But it wasn't Cool Hand Luke, nor was it the grainy, intimate footage from before. This time, the image was different. Paul Newman stood at the edge of a racetrack, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. The sky above him was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind of color that only existed in old home videos, where the sun had bled away the details. A steady wind ruffled his hair, and for a long moment, he simply stood there, looking out at something unseen beyond the frame. Then, without warning, he turned. Claire's breath hitched. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but there was something in the way he moved, something about the sharpness of his gaze as he looked directly into the camera. He wasn't looking at the past. He was looking at her. The film crackled, distorting for the briefest of moments before steadying. Paul exhaled, a slow and measured breath, before speaking. "They always ask the wrong questions," he murmured. His voice was clear, rich with the depth of years, with the weight of things unspoken. "They ask how it happened, why it happened, but they never ask." The film jumped, skipping frames. Claire leaned forward instinctively. Static crackled. The sound faltered. Then, in the space between flickers of light, Paul's voice returned. "They never ask what comes after." The words sent a chill down Claire's spine. And then, as if to punctuate the thought, the screen cut to black. Not with the usual fade-out of old film. Not with the gentle hum of a projector winding down. Just blackness. Final. Absolute. The theater swallowed the sound, leaving only the silence behind. Claire exhaled, but the breath felt too loud, too foreign in the charged stillness of the room. The house was waiting. No, he was waiting. And for the first time, she wondered, had Paul Newman been here all along? Not just as an echo, not just as the lingering presence of a man unwilling to leave, but as someone who was trying to tell her something? And if so, what was it that came after? Claire sat frozen, the weight of the silence pressing down on her like an unanswered question. The screen remained black, but the presence in the room did not fade. It lingered, watching, waiting. She swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a single flicker. The film returned, but it was no longer an image of Paul Newman. Instead, the camera focused on a dusty old leather-bound journal, lying open on a wooden desk. A pen rested beside it, unmoving. The pages fluttered slightly, as if stirred by an unseen breeze, before settling on a passage written in bold, deliberate strokes. Claire leaned forward, her breath caught in her chest as the words came into focus. Not all stories end. Some just wait for someone to finish them. The image wavered, then disappeared. The room fell deathly still. Claire's heart pounded as she pushed herself up from the seat, her mind racing. This wasn't just a haunting, this was a message. A task. A legacy left behind in the shadows of this house. She had spent weeks feeling like Paul Newman's ghost was watching her. Now she understood. He wasn't haunting this place. He was entrusting it to her. Somewhere in this house, maybe in the study, maybe in an old forgotten drawer, was the unfinished story of a man who had never stopped searching for meaning, even after death. And Claire? She was the one who would find it. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.